Tactical specialist Varon Kesh had served alongside 7 different Allied species soldiers in 11 years of joint operations, and he had formed, across those 11 years, a professional opinion about human soldiers that he considered generous, accurate, and relevant to the morning's equipment check. They were reliable, creative under pressure, occasionally reckless in ways that ended up working out, and they had a specific cultural attachment to personal equipment that sometimes resulted in carrying things that should, by any objective measure, have been replaced several technology generations earlier. Corporal Ana Vasquez's rifle was the worst example of this tendency he had ever personally encountered. It was sitting on the inspection table beside her standard-issue kit when Varon entered the equipment staging bay, and it drew his attention immediately, the way genuinely old things drew attention not through elegance or craftsmanship, but through the sheer accumulated weight of their own visible history. The stock was scratched from contacts that had clearly involved more than routine use. The barrel showed the particular patina of metal that had been exposed to more environmental conditions than any controlled refurbishment could fully restore. The scope, which Varon's own weapon systems training would have classified as obsolete 3 generations of targeting software ago, was fixed mount rather than the adaptive variable configuration that standard Threnny tactical equipment had used for the past 60 years. It was, by any defensible tactical assessment, a liability. Vasquez was checking her sidearms charge when he approached, and she looked up at the inspection table, then back at him, with the particular calm of someone who had registered his expression and was neither troubled by it nor interested in addressing it unprompted. "Corporal Vasquez," he said, "your primary weapon manifest is flagged non-standard." "I know." She set down the sidearm. "It's personal issue, approved for joint operations under the Human Contingents Equipment Amendment rider. If you need the authorization code, it's in the briefing package, Appendix 7. I've seen the rider. I'm asking because I want to understand the tactical reasoning." She looked at him with the specific patience of someone deciding whether a conversation was going to be worth the full version of the answer, or whether the short version would serve everyone better. "How long have you been with the Joint Operations Division?" she said. 11 years. "And how many joint operations have included a human contingent?" 4. "Ask me again after this one," she said, and returned to her sidearm check with the particular finality of someone who had just offered the complete version of their answer and expected it to be recognized as such. The mission briefing for Operation Clearwater ran 40 minutes, delivered by Commander Sale Oran in the flat, comprehensive style of a senior Threnny officer who had been briefing joint operations for 30 years and had long since stopped adjusting his pace for the variation in processing speeds across different species. The operation was a 3-day route clearance survey through the Valdres Canyon system, a geologically active network of narrow passages in the planet's equatorial zone, surveying the viability of a proposed infrastructure corridor for the Compact's outer sector expansion program. The team comprised 14 personnel, 8 Threnny and 6 human, and the mission's primary challenge was environmental rather than tactical. The Valdres system's particular combination of fine mineral dust, electromagnetic fluctuation from the geologically active subsurface, and temperature extremes between the canyon's shaded passages and its exposed ridges created conditions that Oran's briefing summary classified, in the direct language of someone who had read the survey reports carefully, as hazardous to electronic-dependent equipment systems at prolonged exposure durations. Varon had read that line in the pre-briefing summary the previous evening and had made a mental note to monitor his own equipment's performance carefully during day 2 and 3, when the prolonged exposure duration would become a genuine variable. He had not, reading the line, thought about Vasquez's rifle. He was aware, with some private embarrassment, that he had not thought about it at all. After the briefing, Walking back to the equipment staging bay, he heard the first of what would become a consistent background noise of the operation's pre-departure period. Comments from the Threnny contingent regarding Vasquez's primary weapon. "The human is carrying antique ordnance," said Specialist Craven Toss, not quietly, to the colleague walking beside him. "I checked the manufacture date against the equipment index. The frame predates the current standard by 4 platform generations. Does it even fire reliably?" "Kinetic systems always fire reliably," Craven said, with the particular tone of someone granting a point they found unimpressive. "They just fire slowly and without any of the adaptive targeting that makes firing quickly matter less." Vasquez, 3 meters ahead of them, did not turn around. Varen, who was close enough to see her expression from his angle, watched her face for a reaction and found none, the particular absence of a reaction in someone who has decided, at some earlier point, that this category of comment no longer warrants the attention that responding to it would require. It was, he noted, the same calm she had applied to his own equipment question that morning. Not defensive, not performatively unbothered, simply not engaged, the way a person was not engaged with a category of input they had long since processed to its conclusion and filed away. The night before departure, Varen passed the team's shared equipment bay on his way to the mission planning room and found Vasquez there alone, the rifle disassembled across a cleaning mat on the central table, working through each component with a cleaning kit whose individual elements showed the same accumulated history as the weapon itself. He stopped in the doorway. She was working the barrel with a bore brush of a type he had not seen outside of technical museum displays, her attention complete and unhurried, and she moved through the components with the particular economy of someone performing a task so thoroughly rehearsed it no longer required conscious direction, just presence. He noticed, on the table's edge, a small data card whose label he could read from the doorway, "Maintenance Log," with the weapon's serial number beneath it. He crossed the room. She did not look up, though he was certain she heard him enter. "How old is the rifle?" he said. She set down the bore brush and reached for the data card, not to hand it to him, but to set it where he could see the display that activated when she turned it over. The log's header showed the weapon's original manufacture date. Varen looked at the number for a moment. "That's 43 years before my own military commissioning," he said. "I know. You were not alive when this was manufactured." "Neither were my parents," she said. "It came to me through my grandmother's estate. She carried it for 28 years of active service before she retired. I've carried it for 12. She returned to the cleaning kit, picking up a patch cloth and working it through the action with the same unhurried economy. 67 years of continuous operational use between the two of us. Every environmental condition in the service record is documented in the log. Has it ever failed?" She was quiet for a moment, the pause of someone giving the question genuine consideration rather than reaching for a quick answer. "3 times," she said. "Once in year 4 of my grandmother's service, a firing pin stress fracture from an impact that should have destroyed the weapon entirely. Once in year 9 of mine, a feed mechanism jam in conditions I'd been warned the weapon wasn't rated for. Once 2 years ago, an extractor spring fatigue failure after 41 consecutive hours of operation in corrosive environment conditions." She set down the patch cloth. "All 3 failures are in the log, with the repair notes. All 3 were field repairable with components I carry in a kit smaller than my sidearm magazine. And your current standard issue alternative would have been replaced at the 4-year mark, the 9-year mark, and well before the 41-hour operation, per the standard upgrade cycle." She picked up the barrel and held it up to the light, checking the bore with the practiced squint of someone performing the final step of a ritual they had performed hundreds of times. "I'm not carrying this rifle because it's better than the current standard specialist Kesh. I'm carrying it because I've had 67 years of documented evidence about exactly what it does and doesn't fail at. And I haven't yet found a weapon in the current catalog with a comparable evidence base for the specific conditions I care about. Which conditions are those? She set the barrel down and looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. The ones where everything else has already stopped working, she said. The operation's first day was unremarkable, and Varen found himself, by midday, observing what he later identified as the most efficiently counterproductive aspect of the Valdres Canyon system's environment. Its first 12 hours were completely benign. The canyon passages were navigable. The temperature variation was within expected parameters. The dust was present but not yet dense enough to affect the electronic systems that the briefing had warned about, and every piece of equipment in the joint team's inventory functioned exactly as it was designed to function. Including, Varen noted with a private irritation, he recognized as unreasonable Vasquez's rifle. Still carrying the antique, Craven Toss said to Varen during the midday rest period, nodding toward where Vasquez was eating, the rifle across her knees in the habitual positioning of someone who kept their primary weapon within immediate reach as a matter of routine rather than situational awareness. She made a reasonable case for it last night, Varen said. She always does. Humans with old gear always do. The case never survives actual contact with modern conditions. Varen did not answer that. He ate his ration and watched the canyon walls and thought, without quite intending to, about 67 years of a maintenance log and a bore brush of a type he had not seen outside of technical museum displays. The evening of day 1 brought the first indication that the briefing's environmental warnings had not been overstated. Specialist Tren Voss, the team's forward sensor operator, reported a partial failure in her atmospheric analysis array at 2140 hours, the particular failure mode that manifested when fine mineral particulates penetrated the array's intake filters faster than the self-cleaning cycle could clear them. It was not, Tren said with the even competence of a specialist managing a known failure mode, catastrophic. The array would function at 60% capacity on its current cycle. She had a field patch that would restore it to 80% by morning. Varen logged the failure and noted, without particular emphasis, that 60% of a sophisticated atmospheric analysis array was still considerably more data than anything Vasquez's optical scope could provide. He was right. He filed the note and moved on. Day 2 began in the Valdres Canyon's deeper passages, where the geologically active subsurface translated into a low, continuous electromagnetic fluctuation that the briefing had described with technical specificity that Varen had read carefully, and now found himself experiencing with the particular bodily recognition of a description proven accurate by direct encounter. The smart targeting integration on his own sidearm secondary system registered its first performance warning at 840 hours, flagging reduced certainty ratings on its environmental compensation model. The warning was within acceptable parameters. He acknowledged it and continued. At 10:15 hours, Specialist Craven Toss's primary weapons adaptive targeting system registered a full recalibration requirement, the first complete loss of targeting compensation in Varen's direct operational experience. The weapon was still functional. The kinetic component still operated, but the adaptive guidance system that transformed a competent shot into a precision one was, for the duration of the recalibration cycle, offline. Craven completed the field recalibration with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained for this failure mode, because the current standard equipment's training protocols specifically included electromagnetic interference recalibration, because the failure mode was known, expected, and accounted for. 40 minutes, Craven said when he finished, with the flat satisfaction of someone who had performed a task correctly. Not bad for full M interference conditions. Vasquez, who had continued walking during Craven's recalibration stop, checked the position of the rifle's iron sights with a gesture so brief and automatic it was easy to miss. It required no recalibration. Iron sights do not have an electromagnetic compensation model to lose. Varon saw it. He was almost certain Vasquez did not know he had seen it. The afternoon of Day 2 introduced the dust conditions that the briefing had warned were the environment's primary equipment hazard, and they arrived with the particular abruptness of weather systems in canyon environments, a shift from navigable to significantly impaired over a period of less than 20 minutes. The Valdres system's mineral dust was not sand. It was significantly finer, the type that infiltrated seals and tolerances at a molecular level rather than simply accumulating on surfaces, and its effect on the joint team's electronic equipment was cumulative in a way that the briefing's general warning had not, Varon now understood, fully prepared him to experience in practice. By 1600 hours, 3 of the 8 Threnny team members had reported equipment degradation of some kind. Tren Voss's atmospheric array, partially recovered from the previous evening's failure, dropped back to 40%. The communications specialist's secondary relay system required a seal inspection that took 20 minutes and found 2 compromised gaskets that needed replacement from the repair kit. Varon's own weapon's smart targeting system issued a second performance warning, more significant than the first, its certainty model now operating at 63% of rated capacity. Commander Oren called a full equipment status check at 1700 hours, and the results confirmed what Varon had already been tracking. The Threnny contingent's sophisticated systems were degrading faster than the briefing's predicted timeline, because the Valdres dust was finer than the survey data had characterized it, a discrepancy that would eventually matter enormously in the final report. He heard the equipment status reports running down the team roster, and he watched each Threnny specialist respond with the practiced calm of professionals managing known degradation within expected parameters. And then he reached the human contingent's reports. 4 of the 5 human soldiers reported equipment status within normal operating range, their systems showing the same degradation curves as the Threnny contingent's comparable equipment. Vasquez reported full operational status on all carried equipment. The rifle did not have a smart targeting system to degrade. It did not have an electromagnetic compensation model to lose certainty ratings. Its tolerances, designed and manufactured 67 years before the current generation of fine particulate standards existed, had been built to the rougher standards of an era when what was expected of field equipment was that it would continue functioning when exposed to conditions the designers could not fully predict. Those designers had clearly been pessimists. The dust had not found the tolerances it needed to compromise. Day 3 began with a situation report that Varon described, in the formal language of his personal log entry, as operationally complex, and, in the private language of his actual assessment, as genuinely alarming. 8 of the 14 team members' primary systems were showing significant degradation. Commander Oren had made the call at first light to push through to the canyon system's eastern exit rather than attempt a return through conditions that were worsening rather than improving, a decision Varon agreed with, which did not make the morning's equipment status review any less difficult to receive. His own weapon's smart targeting system was operating at 31% of rated capacity, which meant it was, in practical terms, providing directional suggestion rather than precision compensation, the difference between a system that made a good shot better and one that was politely confirming the direction of down. Craven Toss's primary weapon had completed its second recalibration of the operation and was currently, in the immediate post-recalibration window, performing nominally. They both understood the recalibration window would not last. At 9:40 hours, moving through the canyon's narrowest passage, the team's forward sensor array issued a failure notification that Tren Vos acknowledged with a quiet efficiency that Varen recognized, from long experience of working with competent people in bad situations, as the efficiency of someone managing a problem they had genuinely prepared for but had hoped not to need to manage this completely. "Array is down," she said. "Manual observation only from this point." At 10:15 hours, the canyon's electromagnetic fluctuation reached a peak level that the briefing had identified as within the possible range, but had characterized as statistically unlikely to persist. It persisted. Craven Toss's weapon issued a recalibration failure notification, meaning the recalibration cycle that had restored it to nominal performance 2 hours earlier could not complete under current conditions, which meant his primary weapon's adaptive targeting was offline for the foreseeable duration. At 10:20 hours, a secondary equipment failure in the team's navigation support system created a brief but significant position uncertainty that required the team to halt and conduct a manual survey using the canyon's visible geological markers, a process the team's human contingent handled with the practiced competence of people trained in pre-electronic navigation, and the Threnny contingent assisted with while privately confirming that their geological survey training had covered this scenario with less emphasis than they now wished it had. Varen checked his own weapon's targeting status at 10:30 hours and found it had dropped below the threshold at which the smart targeting's contribution to accuracy was positive rather than neutral. He switched it off. He was now, in practical operational terms, working with the same fundamental system as Vasquez's rifle, minus 67 years of documentation about its performance in these specific conditions. He was also, he noted with a private precision he would transfer to his formal report later, considerably less certain than Vasquez appeared to be about how the afternoon was going to develop. The incident that resolved the question occurred at 13:47 hours, in the canyon's second-to-last major passage, when the team's motion sensors flagged a stability warning on the passage's eastern wall that proved, over the following 4 minutes, to be a precursor, or to a partial rock fall that blocked the team's forward route and introduced an immediate requirement for the kind of precision task that bad equipment days turned into genuinely serious problems. A geological survey drone, required for the rapid assessment of whether the new blockage was navigable or required a full reroute, ran a pre-deployment check and failed it. The drone's navigation control system was operating below minimum safe deployment parameters. The backup drone was assigned to Specialist Drev Khan, who ran the same check and received the same result. The Valdris dust had found what it needed in the backup drone's control housing's secondary seal. "Manual assessment," Commander Oren said, with the flat certainty of a commander who had already run the options list and arrived at the only one remaining. "I need 2 team members to advance to the blockage and visually assess the passage width on the northern face. If there's a viable route, I need it marked before the dust condition worsens." He assigned Varen to the advance pair, along with Vasquez, the particular assignment logic of a commander sending one person with malfunctioning targeting and one person whose weapon had never had any to malfunction. The advance to the blockage required crossing 40 meters of exposed passage in visibility conditions that the morning's worsening dust had reduced from excellent to genuinely limited, the kind of conditions where the tactical value of a smart targeting system capable of identifying and ranging threats at distance was precisely at its maximum utility, which was specifically the moment when such systems were, across the joint team's inventory, least available to provide it. Varen moved through the passage with his own weapon's smart targeting offline, relying on visual scan and his own judgment, and he was 2/3 of the way to the blockage when the motion from the passage's western ledge resolved, through the dust, into something that required an immediate response. He raised his weapon. The targeting system, offline, provided nothing. Beside him, Vasquez raised hers. He heard it fire twice. The threats on the western ledge did not continue to be threats on the western ledge. The rifle had fired cleanly, in dust conditions that had grounded a survey drone and degraded 3 generations of sophisticated targeting systems to below operational utility, because its mechanism did not ask the dust for permission before functioning. Because its tolerances had been built to survive the worst day its designers had imagined, and this was not that day, not quite. Because 67 years of a maintenance log had documented every condition that could compromise a firing mechanism, and a woman who had inherited that log along with the weapon had read every entry and had kept the components that needed keeping in the condition they needed to be in, and had carried a cleaning kit that looked like it belonged in a technical museum, because the kit was built for this specific weapon, and this specific weapon was still the one she trusted to do this specific job. The blockage was assessed. The route was marked. The team navigated out through the canyon's eastern exit by 1800 hours, all 14 members, with equipment status reports that Varen completed during the final transit and filed before the team had finished clearing the canyon's mouth. He found Vasquez at the operations post-transit equipment breakdown station, running the rifle through the same methodical post-operation cleaning sequence he had watched her begin the night before the mission. The same components in the same order with the same cleaning kit. The dust from the Valdres passages coming off the mechanism, with the particular ease of a weapon that had been maintained closely enough that even the difficult conditions had not found a purchase deeper than the surface. "I want to ask you something," he said. She did not stop working. "Go ahead." "The 2 shots you fired this afternoon, in those conditions, with your targeting offline." "My targeting was never online," she said. "Iron sights don't go offline." "In those conditions," he said again with deliberate patience, "with the dust at that density, at that range, you fired twice." "Yes." "You were certain?" She set down the cleaning patch and looked at him, the same direct, unhurried attention she had given him every time he had asked her something she considered worth answering properly. "I've fired this rifle in dust conditions like that 4 times in 12 years, she said. "Not the exact same dust. Similar enough. I know what the sight picture looks like in those conditions because I've seen it 4 times. I know what the trigger pull feels like through cold stiffened fingers because I've experienced it in 3 different cold environments. I know what target identification looks like at that range and that visibility because I've been to that training environment twice and the ray. Al equivalent 3 times." She picked up the bore brush. "I didn't fire because I was certain in any abstract sense, Specialist Kesh. I fired because I've done the specific work over 12 years that lets me be certain in that specific situation, in those specific conditions, with this specific rifle. And if you'd been carrying a current generation weapon, then I'd have done the same work with that weapon, in those conditions, over 12 years, and I'd have had the same certainty." She ran the brush through the bore with the unhurried precision of someone performing a routine they had performed hundreds of times and intended to perform hundreds more. "The weapon didn't save anyone today because it's old. It functioned today because it was maintained correctly, and I knew it, and I trusted the knowing because the knowing came from evidence rather than assumption." She set the brush down. "Your team spent 2 days watching the current generation equipment fail in conditions the briefing told you to expect. I spent 2 days watching the same conditions and not being surprised, because this rifle's log told me, 67 years ago, what dust like that does to a bore, and I addressed it every evening since I read the log." Varen was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone integrating an understanding that had been building for 3 days and had now arrived at its full shape. "You called it the ugly reliable," he said, "during the pre-mission briefing when the equipment officer flagged it. I've called it that for 12 years. And this afternoon in the passage." She looked at him. "The last one working," he said. "That's what I'm going to call it in my report." She returned to the cleaning kit without comment. The bore brush moved through the rifle's mechanism with the specific patience of someone who understood, without needing to discuss it further, that both names were accurate. Varon filed his formal tactical assessment of Operation Clearwater 11 days later, after the full equipment degradation analysis had been compiled and cross-referenced against the mission timeline, and the report's technical findings consumed 20 pages of specific, documented detail about the Valdres Canyon systems, effects on current generation equipment systems. The report's final section, which his commanding officer had not formally requested, but had not formally discouraged when Varon mentioned he was including it, addressed a recommendation that the Threni Joint Operations Command consider requiring all personnel working with allied species contingents to review whatever documentation existed on their partner's non-standard equipment before dismissing it as sentiment or poor professional discipline. He wrote, "The human contingent's primary kinetic weapon was mocked, at multiple points during the operation's preparation phase, by Threni personnel whose assessment of its tactical value was based on accurate knowledge of its technological generation and a reasonable inference about what technological generation implied for operational performance. The inference was wrong. Not because the weapon was superior to current generation equipment in any condition where current generation equipment performed as designed. It was wrong because current generation equipment's design performance envelope did not encompass the specific conditions of the Valdres Canyon system's Day 2 and Day 3 environment, and the weapon in question was one of the few items in the joint team's inventory that had been documented across 67 years of operational history to function in conditions that significantly exceeded that envelope. He paused before the report's closing recommendation, the section he had been composing in his thinking since the canyon's eastern exit. He wrote, "I recommend that Joint Operations Doctrine be amended to include a mandatory review protocol for any non-standard equipment carried by Allied contingent personnel, with specific attention to operational history documentation rather than technological generation assessment alone. The weapon in question was mocked because it was old. It was the last one working in the conditions that actually obtained because it was old in the specific way that meant it had documentation no current generation system possessed. Those are not the same observation. Distinguishing between them is the kind of tactical judgment that determines whether a mission completes its objectives. I believe we should be better at making that distinction." He closed the file and submitted it. He found, sitting back from the terminal, that he was thinking about a bore brush of a type he had not seen outside of technical museum displays, moving through a barrel in the quiet of a shared equipment bay the night before a mission that had, against his pre-mission assessment, found that particular bore brush's diligence entirely relevant to its outcome. The rifle was, by every defensible technological measure, old. It was also, by the specific and important measure of being the last piece of primary ordnance in the joint team's inventory to function when the conditions became fully adverse, the most precisely reliable thing on the mountain. He had mocked it. He did not intend to make the same judgment error twice. If this one stayed with you, it stayed in the bore brush. Not the 2 shots in the passage, though those are what the mission report cites. The bore brush, moving through the mechanism in the quiet of a pre-mission evening, because 67 years of a maintenance log had told 2 people, in sequence, exactly which part of this rifle needed which attention on which schedule, and both of them had done the work without anyone requiring it of them. Ana Vasquez didn't carry the ugly reliable because she was sentimental. She carried it because sentiment doesn't survive a bore check, and the rifle had survived every bore check for 67 years, and that specific, documented, unglamorous, unheroic evidence was worth considerably more to her, in the conditions that actually obtained, than 3 generations of adaptive targeting that had never been documented in those conditions at all. The mockery stopped on day 2, not because anyone said anything. Because the evidence arrived, the way evidence always does, exactly on its own schedule, whether or not anyone was ready to receive it. Stay human.